Here we'll try to cover the whole of UPSC's ecology in a single class. So the first term is ecology itself. Ecology is nothing but a branch of science where we study the relationship of an organism to its environment or surroundings. The environment or surrounding consists of two components, the biotic and abiotic components. The biotic components are nothing but organisms, that is living plants and animals, whereas the abiotic components are non-living things such as land, air, etc. Next, we move on to a topic called level of organization in the ecology. Again, level of organization consists of four stages: the individuals, the population, community, and ecosystem. The individual is nothing but an organism, let's say a tiger. The population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species, let's say a group of tigers. The community is a group of interacting organisms of different species. For example, let's assume that in a forest, a deer is being eaten up by a group of tigers. So this is an example for interacting organisms of different species. Now, based on the degree of their dependence between different species, the communities can be classified into two types: major communities and minor communities. Now, a major community is a large-sized, well-organized, and independent group of species. For example, the trees in a tropical evergreen forest of the northeastern region. We can easily understand that the existence of one species of tree does not depend on the existence of another species of tree in this ecosystem. So that means there is high level of independence between various species, and hence it falls under the category of a major community. On the contrary, a minor community is just the opposite. In a minor community, the species are dependent on each other to a large extent. For example, the lichen that is growing on a cow dung pad, it's example for a minor community. Next is the term called ecosystem. An ecosystem is a biotic community that exists in integration with its physical environment. This integration of the biotic community or organisms with its physical environment is made possible by two mechanisms: the energy flow and nutrient flow. Here I have given the examples of various ecosystems. You can see forests, grasslands, deserts, etc. in the picture. Now consider a forest ecosystem where there are plants and animals. The green plants perform photosynthesis and converts the solar energy into carbohydrate. The herbivorous animals, when they eat these green plants, they absorb both energy and nutrition from the green plants. So likewise, there is flow of energy and nutrients from the green plants to the herbivorous animals. And this is what I said, that the function of an ecosystem is made possible by two mechanisms: energy flow and the nutrient flow. As we said earlier, there are two components of an ecosystem: biotic components and abiotic components. Biotic components are living plants and animals, whereas abiotic components are like energy, land, air, etc. Now, the biotic component itself can be divided into two major types: autotrophs and heterotrophs. More details about this classification will be explained in the next slide, but for the time being, it is sufficient for you to understand that heterotrophs can again be classified into three categories: phagotrophs, saprophytes, and detritivorous. In the last slide, we mentioned that the biotic components are divided into two categories: autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that provide their own food, that produce their own food. The most common example for autotrophs is green plants. Now we know that the green plants converts carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrate in the presence of sunlight through a process called photosynthesis. Similarly, we can also take the example of a chemosynthetic bacteria such as Vent bacteria, which convert carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide into sugar in the presence of oxygen. Heterotrophs are organisms that depend on other organisms for their nourishment. As we said earlier, the heterotrophs can be divided into three categories: phagotrophs, saprotrophs, and detritivores. We'll consider each one separately now. First is the phagotrophs, or consumers. They are organisms who ingest or swallow their food. For example, humans. They are called consumers because organisms like humans, tigers, lions, etc., they depend on their other plants and animals for their nutrition. And the second category is called a saprotroph or decomposers. These are organisms that feed upon the dead organic matter. So their mode of digestion is actually called extracellular digestion. So what they do is to release certain enzymes into the dead organic matter and cause the release of inorganic substances. And they absorb these inorganic substances. It is usually the bacteria that decompose the dead animal matter, whereas it is the dead plants are decomposed by the fungi. The third category is called detritivores. They feed upon the dead remains of animals and plants. Unlike decomposers, they have intracellular digestion. Let's now move on to the types of ecosystems. They can be broadly classified into natural ecosystems and artificial ecosystems. In both natural and artificial ecosystem, we have terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. For example, a forest is a natural terrestrial ecosystem, whereas an agricultural field is an artificial terrestrial ecosystem. An ocean is a natural aquatic ecosystem, whereas reservoirs are an artificial aquatic ecosystem. Next topic is the structure and function of an ecosystem. A structure is organization of components of an ecosystem. If the biotic components or the animals and plants are arranged based on their food relationships, this arrangement is called a trophic structure. In the given diagram, I have arranged the producers, that is plants, primary consumers, that is herbivorous animals, secondary consumers, that is carnivorous animals, in a trophic structure. Each level, such as producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, are called trophic levels. So when we consider the flow of energy in a trophic structure, we understand that the flow of energy is always in a unidirectional form. That is, the energy moves from the lower trophic levels to the higher trophic levels. As the energy so moves in a trophic levels, much of the energy is lost in the form of heat energy, because when animals move around and when animals catch their prey, they spend a lot of energy or they waste a lot of energy in the form of heat. That means that only very little energy is available to the next trophic level for effective usage. Usually the amount of such a heat loss is almost 90%. That means the trophic level efficiency, or the output energy of a trophic level to that of the input energy received by the trophic level, is only 10% generally. Moving on, the next concept is something called a biome. It's nothing but a bigger version of an ecosystem. So biomes usually occupy large areas and are characterized by specific type of vegetation, climate, and animal types. Let's discuss briefly about some important biomes. I'll discuss tundra and taiga biomes here. The tundra biome is found in the polar regions and is characterized by animals like reindeers, polar bear, Arctic fox, etc. Similarly, there is another biome called taiga or boreal forests. They too occur very close to the polar regions, but in comparatively more moderate temperature areas. These forests are characterized by coniferous evergreen plants like spruce, pines, firs, etc. I'm not intending to explain the rest of the biomes because Anyways, you guys will be learning all these in the geography in much more detail. Another important concept is bio-geochemical cycling. It is the movement of nutrients through various reservoirs in a planet. Now, the nutrients flow from the living organisms or living beings to the non-living beings and back to the living beings. So broadly, there are two types of biogeochemical cycles: gaseous cycles and sedimentary cycles. Oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, all are gaseous cycles, whereas phosphorus and sulfur cycles are sedimentary cycles. The first is a carbon cycle. Now you can see from the diagram that there are four reservoirs of carbon on Earth: the atmosphere, the oceans, lithosphere, and biosphere. The cyclical movement of carbon into the reservoirs, into these reservoirs, and out of these reservoirs is called the carbon cycle. For example, the carbon is present in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and methane. We have to analyze the movement of carbon in and out of the atmosphere. Now, carbon comes to the atmosphere through four different processes: respiration of organisms, decomposition of the dead organic matter, burning of fossil fuels, and diffusion from oceans. The carbon moves out of the atmosphere through a process of photosynthesis. Similarly, oceans also act as a carbon reservoir. Carbon is present in the form of seashells, carbonates, and bicarbonate ions in the oceans. Oceans obtain the carbon from the land through the activity of streams and rivers. The carbon moves out of the oceans again by photosynthesis of marine algae and marine plants. The diagram also shows the movement of carbon in and out of lithosphere and biosphere. The viewers are expected to pay attention to it. I am not explaining the whole concept. Again, this is a schematic diagram of the carbon cycle. You can see that the plants absorbing carbon through photosynthesis. When these plants die, the carbon becomes the fossil fuels, and part of the carbon also reaches the oceans. Through burning of the fossil fuels, expiration of animals, diffusion from oceans, etc., carbon again reaches the atmosphere and the cycle is completed. Next is the nitrogen cycle. So, as you know, nitrogen is the most abundant gas present in the atmosphere, but plants and algae can only use them either as a nitrate or ammonium ion, but not in the atmospheric form. So, the atmospheric nitrogen enters the ecosystem through two different processes. One is lightning and second is the atmospheric deposition. So, during lightning, the nitrogen combines with oxygen and hydrogen of water molecules to form nitrate and ammonium ions. These nitrates and ammonium ions reaches the Earth's surface along with rain, snow, or fog. The second process is something called nitrogen fixation. These nitrogen fixation are carried out by bacteria such as Rhizobium, Astobacter, and Clostridium. For example, the bacterium called Rhizobium, it lives in the root nodules of leguminous plants like pea plants. It converts the nitrogen into usable form for the plants. When these plants die, the nitrogen goes into the soil through organic matter. Now keep in mind that Astobacter is a free-living aerobic bacteria, whereas Clostridium is an anaerobic bacteria. In the aquatic ecosystem, it is the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that helps in the nitrogen fixation. There are two more processes that we need to remember in the nitrogen cycle: nitrification and denitrification. The nitrifying bacteria are Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter, whereas the denitrifying bacteria is Pseudomonas. What they actually does is written in the PPT. You can go through that. Now this is the diagram of nitrogen cycle. You can see that atmospheric nitrogen enters the ecosystem through lightning and nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen is converted to nitrate and ammonium ions due to the action of nitrogen fixers and nitrifying bacteria. Again, the denitrifying bacteria converts the usable form of nitrogen into atmospheric nitrogen, which is circulated back to the atmosphere. As we have said earlier, The biogeochemical cycles consist of both sedimentary cycles and gaseous cycles. Among the sedimentary cycles, we'll study the phosphorus cycle. Now, apart from the fact that the phosphorus cycle is not a gaseous cycle, it also occurs at a very slow pace compared to the carbon cycle or nitrogen cycle. The phosphorus is present on the rocks in the form of calcium phosphate. During mining, weathering, erosion and leaching, this phosphate is released into the soil. The plants absorb this phosphate from the soil and hence the phosphate enters the ecosystem. When these plants die, the phosphorus returns back to the soil. This is the summary of the phosphorus cycle. Now we'll have to discuss a topic called ecological production. It is defined as the biomass production of an ecosystem. When the plants absorb sunlight and make organic compounds such as carbohydrate, it is called primary production. That means the primary production happens through a process called photosynthesis. When the consumers produce the biomass after consuming the plants, it is called secondary production. Now, associated with the primary production and secondary production is a term called productivity. Productivity is the rate at which the solar energy is converted into organic compounds. The gross productivity is the total rate of production. If we take into account the heat loss during the respiration of organisms, we will get the effective energy storage, which is called net productivity. Now, as you can see, the biomass production is influenced by factors such as temperature, water and nutrients. For example, we know that the rate of photosynthesis is comparatively more in the tropical region where solar energy is more available. Similarly, in water deficit regions like deserts, etc., the primary production is very less. So it is very clear that the productivity depends on factors like solar energy, water availability, etc. Next is food chains. It is nothing but a feeding relationship across various trophic levels in an ecosystem. If I have to give the example of a food chain, it will go like, let's say, the green plants being eaten up by rabbits and deers, and who in turn are eaten by lions and tigers. So generally there are two types of food chains, which are grazing food chains and detritus food chains. The primary difference among these two food chains are that in the grazing food chain, the source of energy is the green plant, whereas in a detritus food chain, the dead organic matter is the source of energy. But in a real case scenario, the perfectly linear food chains actually does not exist, and what we have is a complex web of food chains. So this complex web of food chains that exist in reality in an ecosystem is called a food web. Another important topic in ecology is something called ecological pyramids. Now, ecological pyramids are a graphical representation of trophic structures of an ecosystem. There are usually three types of ecological pyramids. First is the pyramid of numbers. The pyramid of numbers is based on the number of individuals at each trophic level. Next is the pyramid of biomass. The pyramid of biomass is based on the dry weight of biomass of organisms at each trophic level. And the last one is the pyramid of energy, which is based on the rate of energy flow through different trophic levels. Here, I have given the figures of pyramid of numbers in three different ecosystems. You can see that the pyramid of numbers is upright in the grassland and pond ecosystem, whereas it is inverted in the case of a single tree ecosystem. Next is the pyramid of biomass. Again, the pyramid of biomass is an upright pyramid or an inverted pyramid. You can see that in a terrestrial ecosystem, the pyramid of biomass is an upright one, but it is an inverted one in an aquatic ecosystem. The third and final one is the pyramid of energy. The pyramid of energy is always an upright pyramid for all the ecosystems. Now we move on to another topic called biotic interactions. When organisms interact with one another, they might either benefit suffer, or there will be no impact at all. So based on this, we can classify interactions between organisms into various types. If both the species benefit out of the interaction, it is called mutualism. An example of mutualism is an insect fetching nectar in a given is given here. In this case, the insect gets its food, that is honey, whereas the plant gets its pollination done. If one species benefit and the other species suffer, it can either be predation, parasitism, or parasitoidism. In predation, we have the example of a tiger chasing a deer. It's given here. Here, the tiger benefits because it gets food, whereas the deer suffers because it's lost its life. Similarly, the ticks that are living on top of the dogs are an example for parasitism. The ticks get food, whereas the dog suffers here. And in parasitoidism, the parasite eventually kills the host. When one species benefits and the other is not affected, it is called commensalism. Here you can see a small fish using the body of a large fish for transportation. As the large fish is unaffected, it's an example for commensalism. Competition is a biotic interaction where both parties suffer, and commensalism is an example of one party suffers and the other one is not affected at all. Tall trees blocking the sunlight for small ones can be a good example for amensalism. The next topic is ecological succession. It is the changes in the biotic communities in an area with time. If a biotic community is occupying a previously unoccupied land, it is called primary succession. For example, consider a rock surface which is freshly exposed after a flood. If the lichens and mosses colonizes that rock surface, it is called primary succession. Consider another scenario where a biotic community was partially or fully removed from a site due to a disturbance, let's say a forest fire. If a vegetation regenerates in that land, it is called a secondary succession because a biotic community already existed there, which was lost due to an event called a forest fire. In ecological succession, the first community is called pioneer community and the last community is called climax community. In the example given here, the mosses and lichens are the pioneer community, whereas the scrubs and forests are the climax community. Each stage in an ecological succession is called a chiral stage, and the sequence of communities is called a seer. We have to compare early and late successional stage in ecological succession. It can be observed that in early successional stages, the growth of the species, the primary productivity, and the diversity are more compared to the late successional stages. This is evident if we consider mosses and lichens as the early successional stage and forests as the late successional stage. There are some other important terms also that deserve attention in ecology. I'm mentioning a few of the important topics here. Ecotone and edge effect are very important concepts. Ecotones are regions where an ecosystem paves way for another ecosystem or transitions into another ecosystem. For example, consider a boundary between a forest and a grassland ecosystem. In the transitional zone or ecotone, the conditions will neither be that of a forest nor be that of a grassland, and the transition happens in a very gradual manner. It is also possible that there are unique species in the transitional areas. Most of the time, there seems to have increased diversity and variety of species in these ecotone areas because animals belonging to both forest ecosystems and the grassland ecosystem might be able to live in the transitional zone between forest and grassland ecosystems. So this phenomenon is called edge effect. That is, the presence of increased diversity and variety of species in the ecotones is called edge effect. Another is a concept called allelopathy. It's a phenomenon where certain plants produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of neighboring plants. An example of a black walnut is given here. So these are the most important concepts that you have to learn for UPSC preliminary from the ecology topic.